Okay, can we hear now? Oh, okay. I was assuming yes. I see some stuff now. Okay, so you might have noticed this that as we proceed to read her, you might notice that although it's a little dense at first, well, she repeats herself a lot. And so even if you didn't get something the first time, there's often ample opportunity for something she's going to bring up numerous times elsewhere. And you might notice that she tends to almost give a little summary of the previous section at the beginning of the new sections, which is helpful, right? So this is a shorter section than the past ones we've been working on. It's the penultimate, meaning second to last one in this chapter, after which in next week, we're going to begin actually looking at labor and what she wants to do with that. But so far, all we've been talking about is the difference between, or the distinctions between the social, the private, and the public, and how historically the rise of one blurred the lines between the other two and landed us where we are now in terms of our economy. So let's find out what that is all about. I'll sort of read and then we can just go through it like we have been doing. Yeah. Cool. What we called earlier the rise of the social coincided historically with the transformation of the private care for private property into a public concern. Society, when it first entered the public realm, assumed the disguise of an organization of property owners who, instead of claiming access to the public realm because of their wealth, demanded protection from it for the accumulation of more wealth. In the words of Baudin, government belonged to kings and property to subjects, so that it was the duty of kings to rule in the interest of their subjects' property. The commonwealth, as has been recently been pointed out, largely existed for the common wealth. Somebody go, what's going on so far?
We're talking about how society started, where it was more of, because in the last section we talked about how wealth and property are not the same.
Mm-hmm.
And so now we're talking about tangible property,
Mm-hmm.
and how with all the walls and everything, that society was made up of all of these individual private lives that all kind of coincided into this public.
Right. So we've got the houses that have the families. And all of this common stuff, which is between all of us, is the common, the public, and originally, of course, the city, eventually the state, but basically where the politics are, right? The body politics. Stuff, right? And then, of course, these individual houses and families were where the private was. But remember that one of the important things that she keeps bringing up is how the physical constitution of the public used to really be physical. So property was having a circle within this circle, right? However, inside, right, because these are just literally the locations, right? But what kind of activities? Well, we know that politics is what goes on in the common, at least potentially. But and inside the private is all those sort of like family lives, right? We'll just do those squiggles. And Arendt's point is that the importance of this difference between the public and the private isn't what goes on inside of the private, right? We're inclined to now think of the private primarily in terms of protection, right? So we might now think of related to, right, for instance, like our right to privacy, right, is really our right to not have someone looking at us while we're pooping, right? So the concern for there being a different space for stuff is really about space. It's about, like we were talking about, like she kind of obsesses, the walls. It doesn't matter so much what goes on in the house, so much as that there is a difference between what goes on in the house and what goes on outside of the house, right? So that is, now with society, well, the issue is that it isn't properly located in any one of these circles. The social is kind of everywhere, right? You have friends all over the place. You have your jobs, which are neither in your house nor strictly public. There's private corporations. All of that stuff is one of the things that can go on in the private, but it's not what actually makes the difference between private and public, right? But society, because it blurs the lines, like we were talking about, in which these become far more porous, like then in that case, there's no direct spatial location to society. Similarly, there's no direct spatial connection to wealth either, right? Whereas property is literally having a patch of space that belongs to you. Wealth is, well, what is wealth?
Something that you can consume.
So you can consume wealth. We'll talk about how we do that in a little bit. But the one of the points she's making in this paragraph is that one of the things that went on in the household, one of the activities in it, right? Not one of the boundaries of the laws or anything, but one of the things that goes on in private life is, in as much as all housekeeping is management of some kind, right? Management of wealth. So being wealthy didn't necessarily give you a place like this because there were wealthy slaves, there were wealthy foreigners. To be a citizen is to have a patch of it that constitutes the whole. But of course, we all have to eat, right? And so, and this still sometimes happens, right? You have families in, say, the United Kingdom, like noble families that still have their castles or their palaces or whatever, but they're broke, right? And so that's also why you can really buy a castle for relatively inexpensively, depending on what you consider expensive, right? But one of the activities which has to go on in private is just the fact that we have to balance the checkbook, we have to provide for the needs, and that gets us into how wealth is still relevant for the public, even though it's not originally one of the things that makes you part of the public, right? Because even if you have your own land, you still have to eat, right? So both are important, but they're not the same thing. All right, so let's see where else we can go from there. Right. When this commonwealth, the result of activities formerly banished to the privacy of the household, was permitted to take over the public realm, private possessions, which are essentially much less permanent and much more vulnerable to the mortality of their owners than the common world, which always grows out of the past and is intended to last for future generations, began to undermine the durability of the world. So, right, like we said, wealth, the acquisition of wealth, the management of wealth was one of those activities formerly banished, as she says, which we keep it at home because that's where it matters, right? But once that becomes a public concern, or rather, once it takes on the guise or the disguise of a public interest, well, what is that interest then, right? How does private wealth or property become a public concern, for instance, for us now?
Does private wealth become a public concern?
Yeah. Or it's not a literally public concern, but how did wealth sneak in through the social into the public? That's probably part of it, taxes, right? But more generally, not just the taxes, but the fact that now that wealth is a thing, right? Now that there's such a thing as liquid capital, wouldn't it be nice if someone protected it? Insurance companies. I mean, that again, those are all examples of something whereby something that becomes that is in the original sense, a private concern, all of a sudden means, right, I need to be healthy, which means I, for instance, need medical care when I need medical care, right? Isn't it bizarre that my medical care should depend on finding someone who's able and willing to help me pay for it? Bizarre, I mean, in the sense that, yeah, I know that's how the reality is, but isn't that a little like, it raises the immediate questions, which throws everyone into panics, which is just like, what if you can't pay for stuff, right? And so that would be an example of something where, like, and remember, if you were a sick person in the past, you weren't free because you were subject to the necessity of being a sick body at that moment. And so, let's see. Yeah, no, so there's all kinds of ways in which once private wealth is accumulated, then it can take on the disguise of public significance by saying, well, now I need protection for my wealth in all kinds of forms, right? Whether it's in the form of government insurance, whether it's in the form of some kind of like, well, whether it's any kind of economic activities which are designed for me to kind of expect, in this case, the government or society to help me protect my private wealth, right? And that's another sense in which we can wind up with very wealthy societies, right? In which you just have societies where people make a lot of money, right? So, but let's move on to see where this sort of also goes, because, yeah, it's true that wealth can be accumulated to a point where no individual lifespan can use it up, so that the family, rather than the individual, becomes its owner. And this is how you wind up with wealthy families, right? Like the Rothschilds and other really rich, famous people, right? The Rockefellers, even like the Koch brothers, like who have a bunch of stuff here on campus. It's true that you can make so much money that you can't use it all in one lifetime, right? I mean, who does this remind us of? Jeff Bezos, right? Elon Musk, people who have so much wealth that it's truly mathematically mind-boggling, because there's no way one person will ever use up all that money, right? But then, yet wealth remains something to be used and consumed, no matter how many individual lifespans it may sustain. Only when wealth became capital, whose chief function was to generate more capital, did private property equal or come close to the permanence inherent in the commonly shared world.
That was confusing to me because it was like, it went from talking about the impermanence of wealth into somehow that translating into the permanence of private property.
Right, well, so yeah, that's a good question. Wealth doesn't become private property. I mean, it doesn't become private property in the sense in which we're talking about, right? The original sense of like, it's private in the sense that it only belongs typically to one person, but it doesn't really become what private property used to be. But what she's talking about there, I think, is like, what she's pointing out is that wealth can become, in a certain sense, durable, right? When you think about private property, the value of private property is that it gives you a literal place in the world from which you can then go out into the public, but also obviously that can be additionally a place to live, a place which is going to outlast you, right? Because chances are that the houses are going to last longer than you will, maybe. But in the same way, like I said, you can, one, get a house which is going to house you for all of your life, or you can make enough money to where you're not going to run out, right? Those are both kinds of durability. One in which it's like, well, the house isn't going to run out unless it's destroyed literally by a natural disaster or by neglect or something. And similarly, you can get money to a point where it's also, so to speak, not going to run out, right? But even when you do that, even though money can approximate, or rather wealth can approximate this durability, as we're going to see right now, it's not the same kind of durability, and we'll see why, right? However, this permanence is of a different nature. It is the permanence of a process rather than the permanence of a stable structure. Without the process of accumulation, wealth would at once fall back into the opposite process of disintegration through use and consumption. Does that make sense to people? So what do you guys think it means? It's the permanence of a process rather than the permanence of a stable structure. That's
like, I guess you could view it in terms of like, if you're working, you have like a steady flow of income. So you have sort of permanence of wealth, even though you don't have like a lump sum necessarily that you're.
okay, that's a good point, right? If you do have a stable job, then in that sense, it's kind of like, isn't it just the case that every payday money somehow winds up in my bank account? And as long as it doesn't run out, I'm pretty okay. I'm like, okay, it's like, so that's one way in which definitely, it is the permanence of a process. Yeah.
I was thinking about like the process of us accepting it, because if one day all America says, oh, we're trading in Beyblades now, Jeff Bezos is now broke and my little cousin is wealthy beyond imagine.
Yeah. That's definitely a good point too. A lot of this whole thing we have set up depends upon the fact that we currently have an economic system and an exchange rate for currencies that is indexed to other things. So in that sense, it's a process we keep going because we keep spending and using money, right? Yeah.
Kind of on what you just said. It said on 68, it says it's like ish. Come on, where did it say that? It was talking about you get wealth and then you start exchanging it for more wealth. It was in the first paragraph it goes who, instead of claiming access to the public realm because of their wealth, demanded protection from it for the accumulation of more wealth. So the process is more of just using your wealth that you have now to get more. And
Right.
so that permanence is the process rather than what you're actually getting from it.
Right. And then similarly, like you pointed out, like that instead of having people who have wealth and probably property and therefore are able to sort of demand access to the public because you're able to do the political thing now. Now, it seems, at least according to this transition, with the rise of the social and the nation states, rich people aren't interested in politics, right? At least, not primarily. That now it's instead of being like, okay, good, my needs are met. I have a house, I have like a family, I have a farm, I have like slaves. Now I can go do politics. Instead, it becomes, how do I make more money? Because I'm going to need that in the future, right? Which makes sense. You're not going to need money in the future, probably. But that changes the process of what we're now looking at, right? We're looking at a process of accumulation and wealth growth and retention rather than just building a homestead so you can be secure, right? Not knocking either of them, just saying it is a different thing you're doing. You buying a house is different than you buying groceries. And not just because you don't do one with as much frequency as the other, right? It's because you're not going to eat the groceries. I mean, it's because you're going to eat the groceries and not eat the house, right? So, commonwealth, therefore, so we're positing there is such a thing as commonwealth. You might think of it as, I don't know, GDP. Commonwealth can never become common in the sense we speak of a common world. It remained, or rather was intended to remain, strictly private. Only the government, appointed to shield the private owners from each other in the competitive struggle for more wealth, was common. The obvious contradiction in this modern concept of government, where the only thing people have in common is their private interests, need no longer bother us as it still bothered Marx. Since we know that the contradiction between private and public, typical of the initial stages of the modern age, has become a temporary phenomenon, which introduced the utter extinction of the very difference between the private and public realms, the submersion of both in the sphere of the social. So breaking that long sentence up really quickly, again, these are reminders that should sound familiar to you. What she's saying is, retrospectively, because hindsight's 2020, we can see that this whole social thing was really just a stepping stone. Initially, it was kind of awkward at first. Now that even though it produces this weird contradiction in which the only thing we have in common is our private interest, we'll return to that, that's important. But nevertheless, we're told that, as she says, it was a temporary phenomenon which introduced the utter extinction of the very difference between private and public, the submersion of both in the social, which is now what she thinks we are. But the contradiction is that, again, remember, politics was the common, right? It was the point of like having a public and having a separate sphere of life where you are able to experience political freedom. In the case of acquiring wealth, it's not as though you ever intend, I mean, if you're serious, right? The acquisition of wealth, although we can be delusional and like sort of hippie about it, is always something you want to keep, right? It's not like I would like us all to be wildly rich. Yes, of course, but as long as I could stay rich, like, so that's kind of where that is going. And in that sense, if the only thing that becomes common to us is the government whose regulation and or lack of regulation is just designed to ensure that we can all try to grow our wealth, then that is what it means to say that we now no longer have anything in common except our private interests, right? It also probably explains why many of us, if you really, at least this is from my experience, so I'm just confessing, would like more than anything with regard to like, what do you want your relationship to the public to be and for the government to be and to politics to be? Speaking for myself, I would really like to kind of just be left alone, right? At least that's one way of looking at it, right? It's sort of like you can look at this big public endeavor that involves all of the public and political life, and it's just like, no, I'd rather like go to a movie with my friends or like chill at Starbucks or just like whatever I'm doing, like indulge in TikTok, like whatever it is, I just don't want to have to deal with it, right? So in that sense, we are all living right now, because we can say this because it's already happened, right? We're all living in an awkward thing and where it's true, as I've already told you, that physically speaking, as far as the common world goes, we have all of this in common, right? But as far as our actual individual like bank accounts and economic assets and all that goes, we're all like lone wolves, right? Basically. It's in that sense that common wealth, although it can be common in the sense of being related to a common denominator, namely money, and represented like something that belongs to all of society, like a GDP, wealth can't be held in common the same way stuff can. This is what she's saying. She might be wrong, and I'm not sure it makes a perfect sense, but that is at least the claim she's making. That because of what it is, wealth can't become common the way that a world can. So that even if you have a really wealthy society, it does not mean that you have a really healthy world, right? But by the same token, we are in a far better position to realize the consequences for human existence when both the public and private spheres of life are gone. The public, because it has become a function of the private, and the private, because it has become the only concern left, common concern left. Seen from this viewpoint, the modern discovery of intimacy seems a flight from the whole outer world into the inner subjectivity of the individual, which formerly had been sheltered and protected by the private realm. The dissolution of this realm into the social may most conveniently be watched in the progressing transformation of immobile and mobile property until eventually the distinction between property and wealth, between the fungibiles and consumptibiles of Roman law, loses all significance, because every tangible, fungible thing has become an object for consumption. It lost its private use value, which was determined by its location, and acquired an exclusively social value, determined through its ever-changing exchangeability, whose fluctuation could itself be fixed only temporarily by relating it to the common denominator of money. Right? Did that make sense to you? What needs unpacking? Like we've been saying, right? Wealth and property aren't the same thing. But when we begin to equate them, and it's so much so that we think they're identical, then another meaning behind saying that money only has the permanence of a process is that what is money for? Buying things. What happens if you don't buy things and you just have it?
It just builds up.
You can acquire. I mean, you can definitely build an endowment or something like. You don't always have to spend all your money. But what would happen if nobody spent any money? Like presumably you all know this, right? But the value of our money changes regularly, right? That's why, that's why there's exchange rates with other currencies, right? That's why sometimes the pound is worth more than the dollar. And I mean, it usually is, but that's why sometimes the euro, for instance, the euro is more volatile than the pound sterling. But that's why sometimes euros are worth more than the dollar, and sometimes they're not. Which is also why sometimes you can take a cool, inexpensive euro trip, and other times not, right? Money, the value of money changes. And that's a weird thing because probably chances are when you think about it, especially, I mean, certainly when I think about it, I just think about it in terms of the number in my bank account, right? But the truth is that number is highly volatile because the real thing that gives it value is its relationship to a sovereign economy that can back it up, right? Which is itself, which themselves, despite there being sovereign governments like the US government, the British government, still is beholden to a globalized economy where everything's interconnected, so that in reality, the only real value that your money has is the fact that you can buy things with it, right? And whenever you are able to buy more things with your money, we consider that you have more buying power and hence are wealthier. And when your money cannot get you as much stuff, then we consider you as having lower buying power and we consider you poor. But that is how that works, right? Money is not intrinsically valuable. It's only valuable because it's a common denominator between the different kinds of stuffs we can want to buy, right? I want a blackboard. How much do I have to pay for it? I want a Gucci bag. How much do I have to pay for it? And how much we have to pay for it is not intrinsically related to the thing we're buying, which is also why there are things which are intrinsically pretty silly or pointless or worthless, which cost a hell of a whole lot of money, right? If you you can easily just think to yourself like this, even if you're like going to HEB or something, you're just like, why does this cost that much? Especially if it changes price from like season to season, you're like, why am I paying $4 for a pomegranate? Or, you know, like that, right? But that, so that if we do trade property for wealth, or if we equate them or associate them too strongly in our mind, what made sense of all of this is that it was literally about the space between my front door and the sidewalk, right? And so the value of having property was very closely indexed to a physical, tangible place or thing. And again, it's not that wealth is not real. There's is obviously such a thing as wealth, but it's that what you trade for in value, the value you have here is of the value you have of having a house, for instance, and having property is technically, at least supposed to be, a use value, right? It's valuable because you can use it. And using it, as opposed to consuming it, means being able to use it for a long time. The value of money is not, and wealth is not use value, although we do theoretically use it to buy things. What really gives it its value, because that's what we're talking about, what gives the thing its value, right? Not what we technically do with it. What gives use objects their use value is what they can be used for and how durable and reliable they are for our purposes. What gives wealth its value is its exchangeability, which means that if you trade property for wealth, you're trading something tangible for something that isn't tangible, first of all, so it's much harder to conceptualize, but also something whose only value lies in the fact that you can't keep it. Right? Is that making sense to people a little bit? Okay. Seen from, and of course, context 2020, which is what the last sentence that paragraph means, we're able to, even though it might not, haven't thought about it before necessarily reading this book, we do have the opportunity to see what the consequences were for us, because you all are the ones who are having to live through it, right? Seen from this viewpoint, the modern discovery of intimacy seems a flight from the whole outer world into the inner subjectivity of the individual, which formerly had been sheltered and protected by the private realm. The dissolution of this realm into the social may conveniently be watched by closely connected with the social evaporation of the tangible. Was the most revolutionary modern contribution to the concept of private property, according to which property was not a fixed and firmly located part of the world, acquired by its owner in one way or another, but on the contrary, had its source in man himself, in his possession of a body and his indisputable ownership of the strength that is this body, which Marx called labor power. Okay? Thus, modern property lost its worldly character and was located in the person himself, that is, in what an individual could lose only along with his life. So what does that mean? To say that property lost its worldly character just means that, like we've been talking about, the world is the artifice of human things and stable human things, right? The big projects, not like not the consumptibles. So to say property lost its worldly character is like, well, we no longer think of property in that way anymore. But what does it mean to say that it lost its worldly character and was located, right, in the person himself, in a way which you could only lose when you die?
Just then we were talking about how a house had use value, and now itself had use value.
That's an interesting way of putting it. Why don't you work that out a little more?
Because it was talking about.
You do speak up, man. Like,
No, yeah. So with labor power, it was talking about in the page 70, it goes, was not fixed and firmly located part of the world acquired by its owner in one way or another, but contract had its source in man itself. So the value that an object has was given by the work that the man put into it,
Yeah,
kind of.
yeah, no, that's definitely, we're on the right track. I'm just bad at drawing, so give me a second. Right, the whole point is this is a world, we get this. I don't have to draw a perfect globe at the same time I'm trying to talk about it. So remember that at the beginning in the prologue, Arendt pointed out and said, first of all, I have no solutions to these problems that I'm raising. So I'm just going to throw you into the turmoil of talking to you about the evolution of our political economy and how it resulted in such that you are all, unbeknownst to yourselves, laboring slaves, basically. But she points out that the purpose of the historical analysis that she's writing is precisely to trace two things, right? One, what she calls the flight from the what? Flight from Earth, where? Where do we all want to go now that we know where do we all want to go now that we know we can escape the Earth?
Oh, space.
Yeah, from the Earth to the universe. Right? And so you can imagine like there's us, and on one flight we're trying to do is like to escape. Not that we're all individually going to do it, but that historically we can look, okay, one purpose is to see how do we get from being earthbound creatures to the kind of creatures who now literally sort of shoot for the stars, right? So that's the first point of all of this history we're getting, right? How we went this flight of this running away from the Earth to the universe. But there's another flight that we were talking about. All of you did perfectly on this quiz, so I assume that you may probably know it. What's the other flight that we're tracing? Any of y'all remember?
Is it from being like, I don't know how to word it, but like how we're trying to make artificial life and stuff now, like being down to.
Yeah, that's definitely closely related to this one. So another way of looking at this one is, of course, these movements they're real movements, but they're more like sort of symbolic, right? Our flight from the Earth to the universe shows our kind of desire to not be purely natural, right? To trade what we didn't make, our given kind of created status, for something that we did make, right? Whether that is genetically modified babies or, gene therapy healed people, cancer patients, like the desire to conquer nature, basically. Ultimately, up to and including leaving the Earth for somewhere else, right? The other flight is from world to self, right? So there's another ironic kind of thing that happens, which is at the same time that we're trying to fly from the Earth to outer space, which is metaphoric for escaping our naturalness. At the same time, there's another interesting fleeing, which instead of going outward, has been going inward, right? Where a lot of things that used to be located or thought of as outside of us have now, in a really interesting little weird way, been pushed up inside of us, right? Almost like we roly-polied or something, right? We'll talk about this at a later point. This particular move begins with a person called Descartes, right? And if you may remember that the famous thing Descartes said was, I think, therefore I am, right? You may have heard that sort of thing. I think, therefore I am. We will talk about Descartes later, so I won't explain this just now. But the part of that move is to say that property used to exist out here, right? Now, what happened with the rise of society, which also coincided with the rise of modernity, is that what we think of as property was pushed up into us, right? Having a literal piece of land is not the same thing as being able to work. In the same way that having that land is not the same thing as having money with which to upkeep it. And so what we're getting at is this idea that whereas property was originally located externally, which is how it got its value, it was a location, it was a place you could retreat to, right? Which is again part of what it means to suggest that it's like a shelter for you. Now, property is supposed to have its origin not in the world of things that we made and having a piece of it, but somehow being a me, right? Being an I, being a self. And this is partly how that went. Does this make any sense to anyone so far? Like the movement, not that we have to know what all the movement means, but like we have the one, which is ironic, simultaneously while we're trying to leave the earth, we're also retreating further and further into our skull. So it's like, which one do we want?
Because the value of property has shifted from being its physical value into the amount of work a man's self-labor put into it.
That is what this theory of property became. So there's another philosopher named John Locke, right? Very influential on English and American tradition. And what he advocates in sort of his philosophy is something which many people now assume just always has been the case. Because a lot of times what political philosophers try to do is to go back speculatively in history to try to show how their economic ideas make sense since the very beginning, since like cavemen, right? Marx tries to do this, everyone tries to do it. What Locke tried to do was to say, let's pose property as a problem, right? How is it possible to own anything? Oh yeah, you can buy it, but I mean, why should that make it yours? If so, we're at the grocery store. You hand me your little plastic card, or let's be serious, you're at self-checkout, right? You put in your little plastic card, and yeah, there's an exchange that supposedly happens, but why does that make it okay for me to walk out of the store with the groceries? What does that transaction have to do with reality? Even if it wasn't an actual card, you give me like, you're driving up and you give me like, I'm selling lemonade. You give me the $1 and I give you the cup of lemonade. What does that exchange have to do with me drinking the lemonade and you getting the $1? Damn it.
I mean, it's just a framework that we've designed in order to distribute resources.
That's definitely, that sounds right to me. Although that does just say, well, this is how we've set it up, right? So if we really think about it, if I was prepared to take Eli's book, right? Like, of course we could point to the absurdity, I have one. But again, let's suppose I'm just a mean bully, right? And I want Eli's book. What makes it his? Well, we'll put a pin in that, right? Because there's kind of an answer. Sort of, but this would be a part of the traditional answer. What Locke starts out from is the idea that everybody owns themselves, right? Does that seem plausible? Might or might not. We got one person who says it is. Does it make sense to say, does it make sense to you? Just like feel it out right now. Say, I own myself. Just quick show of hands. To whom does that make sense being compelling? Yeah, I own myself. Okay. Does there anyone who that it doesn't make sense yet? Just like, I'm not sure. But that's okay too, right? But if we start off with this assumption, everybody owns themselves, which effectively means, let's be serious, everybody owns their bodies, right? What else would that mean, right? Because you own your body, so the story goes, you also owns the labor of your body, right? That's what it means to suggest that you have a labor value. There's mechanical things we can do with your body, right? So if everybody owns the labor of their body, then what happens if you mix your labor with something? So the story goes, this is called the mixing theory, right? Of property. So the story goes, Eric the Red, a Viking, comes to Iceland where there's nobody yet, so we think, and works a field that he finds, and plants some potatoes. In due course of time, potatoes are grown and he harvests them. Are the potatoes Eric the Red's? Does he own the potatoes? What do y'all think? Does the Viking own the potatoes?
Yes.
Why does he own the potatoes?
He put his labor into the ground to make it grow.
Okay, so because he put his labor into the ground to make them grow. How does that sound to people? He labored to bring forth the potatoes, we might say, something like that. Okay, interesting thought there. How about the land he used? What's his relationship to that land now that he has labored on it and brought forth something from it? Spencer?
Obviously, I guess if no one else like owned it and people were just claiming properties that no one owned, then it's
Okay, yeah, that's a good caveat, right? If there was nobody else who owned it, right? What do you got?
I don't think his labor really had anything to do with it. The moment he like showed up, it was like, this is mine. If no one else was like, this is mine, and no one's gonna fight him for it, then it's his.
Right. Okay, that's an interesting way too, right? There's a sense in which we might also think, well, what makes it Eli's book? The fact that he has it, and if I try to take it from him, he can stop me, right? And then it becomes a very classic, well, a little bit of an absurd fight over a book, but it does become the classic fight of it's mine, no, it's mine, right? And he could probably be, right? So we can say the book's probably Eli's. However, the way this traditional story would go is that he begins to own the land insofar as he is laboring on it, as long as, again, he leaves enough and good enough for other people, right? So it makes it weird that, I mean, the reason why we do this thought experiment in Iceland is because there weren't people in Iceland, like in the same way we think about, right? There's obviously, there's lots we could say about Locke. We're not going to focus on the rest of this thing. But the point is that it begins by situating your ownership as something of you yourself. And then by you somehow putting yourself out there and laboring, you can sort of, I don't know, it's a weird way of putting it, but you sort of infect the external world with your labor and sort of bring it unto you. But that does also mean that it's only yours, really, as long as you are laboring on it, right? If you stopped, and that was also why, in case you all didn't know, that was one of the very classical justifications for the despoiling of the Native Americans, because part of this tradition is like, well, yeah, they were here, but they weren't doing anything with it, right? So it's not a perfect theory or account of things. But the point is that compared to the past idea of property, this new property theory was bizarre. It's like literally, it's going from the space around you to saying the way I have power or the way I have the ability to own things rather is through my ability to labor.
Well, with that, like as long as you're laboring with something, you own it. If I show up on this Viking's land, like I'm planting my potatoes now, do I just have a chunk of it as long as I continue to labor on it, or is it just kind of like, oh, he was already there?
I mean, part of the proviso for saying you have to leave as much for others is to say that if you show up, I mean, it's going to be complicated if you show up and you start trying to till my land, right? But it's assuming that there's fields over there and you go do that, then you too ought to be able to own something by mixing your labor with it, right? One of the problems naturally that gives rise to, which you probably appreciate, is the question of what the hell happens when we run out of land. But again, we didn't get that far. There was so much of it in the early modern period. We didn't think that was going to be a thing. No, probably nobody guessed. My guess would be nobody initially guessed that almost all of Texas would be privately owned by somebody, because it is. In case you didn't know, we have vanishingly little public land in Texas. But the point is though that that's what that second move is. We're going to start seeing the relocation of things that used to be outside of us into inside of us, including labor, right? Part of why last time we talked a little bit, we didn't get very far about intellectual property, is that intellectual property doesn't really make sense on the old model of property because it's not external anywhere. But it makes a lot of sense as something that has an exchange value for which you might make money.
Because you labored it.
Well, I mean, in that sense, well, yes, technically we labored it, the intellectual property. But the point is that with the intellectual property, now property derives its value from your ability to exchange it for something else usually money, which you can then exchange for other stuff, right? So what property used to be was a location in which somebody inhabited, and now property is something that can potentially make you money, which is what, for instance, copyrights and patents are really designed to protect. Copyrights and patents don't exist to protect the individual thing you invented, right? Because part of why we want there to be patents and copyrights, particularly patents, right, is that we want them to become public knowledge because we want them to be used, right? If you invent a really cool thing or whatever, eventually we want it to proliferate in society. But you're not going to release your invention if you're not going to be able to make any money off of it. So what patents allow you to do is to make a certain amount of money off of it for a certain amount of time, as long as you renew your patent. And so that way you can have the thing, public can have it, and yet you can still make money off of it, right? The point is that all of are now part of how we have changed our beliefs and attitudes about property is that all of it now seems to be defined in terms of the ability to accumulate wealth, which is what people are interested in. But wealth itself, like we're saying, however important it may be, is not the same thing as what property used to be. And its value comes from a very different place, which is partially what makes it so precarious. The fact that it doesn't have a stable value. Yeah, George?
So you're saying that with the property, it's like, as long as you leave enough for others, if you don't, you lose your right to own it.
I'm not an expert on Locke. I only know that much of his theory, but I think it can get complicated. Part of what those provisos are supposed to explain is, again, how we all can wind up owning things, because then it might make you wonder why I can't just go, like the absurd, like a lot of people think that the mixing theory of labor is absurd. And one of the really famous examples they give is this one, right? I dump a can of tomato juice into the ocean. Have I not mixed my labor with it somehow? But is it reasonable for me to think that I own the ocean because I dumped a can of tomato sauce in it?
Did you make the tomato sauce?
Is that going to change it? Is me having made like a super fancy recipe, like original Italian, like whatever, from my non-existent Italian grandma, is that going to change the absurdity of suggesting that I mixed a little bit of my labor into the thing and now I own the Atlantic? Oh, last thing. What first?
So how far does the mixing theory go? Like with that you just said. So you dump the tomato juice into the ocean. Let's say for some reason you do own the ocean now. Can Heinz be like, well, I make tomato juice, so I own the tomato juice, so I own the ocean?
Right. The purpose of the thought experiment is to show how messy that would get, and it is meant to make us challenge the plausibility of the initial thing. Because the point is, although it makes sense at a certain scale, it seems obvious that you don't own the Atlantic, or even, for instance, even if you peed in the ocean, right? Like that's even more direct than, but in the same way that you can't own a pool by peeing in it, it doesn't seem like you can own the ocean by peeing in it. But we'll see you guys Monday. Oh, I'll make it and extend it.